The November sleet wasn't just rain, it was tiny needles of ice, driven by a wind that howled down the canyons between New York's skyscrapers. It found every seam in Marissa Kelly's worn-out jacket, every tear in her thin gloves. Each breath she took was a painful, freezing gasp. Below her, the pedals of her battered bicycle protested with a metallic groan, the chain slick with a mixture of grime and icy water. Just one more delivery, she told herself, the words a silent mantra against the rhythm of her chattering teeth. One more, and you can pay the rent for tomorrow. But it wasn't just the rent. It was the phone call from an hour ago, the voice on the other end low and growly. A predator toying with its prey, the clocks ticking. Marissa, your father's debt didn't disappear with him. We know where your brother goes to school. The threat hung in the frigid air, heavier than the storm clouds overhead. Her father, a ghost who had gambled away their lives, had left her with his demons. Her phone buzzed. The screen, a cruel, bright rectangle against the gloom. It was a message from her dispatch manager. Last order, 87th in Park. Don't be late. Park Avenue felt a world away from the gritty Queen Street she was on now. It was a world of warm doormen and glowing lobbies. A world that had no idea she existed. She pushed harder, her leg muscles screaming in protest. The city blurred into a watercolor of smeared headlights and bleeding neon signs. People hurried past heads down shoulders, hunched faceless shapes in the storm, each locked in their own private struggle. No one looked, no one saw. That's when she saw her. At the edge of a desolate bus stop, its plastic shelter cracked, and useless stood an old woman. She wore a fine wool coat, but it was unbuttoned, useless against the biting wind. Her silver hair was soaked plastered to her pale skin. She was staring into the street, her eyes vacant, lost in a fog. Marissa recognized not as confusion, but as something deeper, a place beyond the storm. Her hands, adorned with elegant rings, trembled as she clutched a small embroidered purse. People flowed around her like a river around a stone, their indifference a force of nature in itself. Marissa slowed 1 foot, dragging on the pavement, the worn rubber hissing against the wet asphalt. Don't stop! The voice of panic screamed in her head. The debt your brother, you can't afford this. The manager's warning echoed the loan shark's threat. Being late wasn't an option. It was a catastrophe. She pedaled forward, the bike lurching away from the bus stop. 10 for 20. The image of the woman was burned into her mind, the tremor in her hands, the way the wind whipped her thin coat, the profound soul, deep loneliness in her posture. Marissa's own mother had looked like that in the hospital in those last few weeks, brave and proud, but slowly being erased by an illness no one could stop. Damn it, she whispered, the curse a cloud of white vapor. She squeezed the brakes, the pads squealing in protest. With a sharp, resigned turn, she wheeled the bike around and coasted back to the bus stop, the silence broken only by the hiss of her tires. Ma'am, she said, her voice softer than she'd intended. Are you okay? The buses stopped running an hour ago. The woman turned her gaze, slowly focusing on Marissa. Her eyes were a startling, intelligent blue, but they were clouded, searching for a memory that wasn't there. I was waiting for James, she murmured, her voice frail, but tinged with an accent of old-world grace. He was supposed to pick me up. Marissa's heart sank. There was no one else on the street. Is there someone I can call for you? The woman. Morgan just shook her head, a flicker of fear crossing her face. No phones. He'll be here. She shivered violently, wrapping her arms around herself. Marissa looked at the woman's thin, elegant shoes soaked through. She looked at her own cracked phone screen, the time mocking her. 9:47 p.m. The delivery was due by 10 Holberers. She was already impossibly late. She was fired. The thought landed with a cold, hard finality. With the job went the last fragile line of defense against the men her father had unleashed upon her. In that moment, a strange calm washed over her. If she was already ruined, what was one more act of foolishness? "My name is Marissa," she said, her voice steady now. "James isn't coming, ma'am. It's too cold to wait here. I'm going to take you home." Morgan looked at her, then at the rickety bicycle. A flicker of her former, sharper self surfaced. On that contraption, Marissa managed a small, tired smile. "It's not a carriage, but it's warmer than standing still. There's a rack on the back. It's stronger than it looks." She took off her own thin but dry scarf. "Here." She gently wrapped the scarf around Morgan's neck, her cold fingers brushing against the woman's soft, wrinkled skin. For a second, Morgan resisted. Then she leaned into the small warmth, a sigh escaping her lips. Getting Morgan onto the rear rack was a clumsy, difficult process. The woman was frail, but her wool coat was heavy with water. Finally, she was perched sideways, clutching Marissa's shoulders. "Hold on tight," Marissa said, swinging her leg over the frame. She pushed off from the curb, the bike wobbling under the unfamiliar weight. Her muscles, already exhausted, screamed as she began to pedal into the teeth of the wind. The delivery bag containing a stranger's forgotten dinner thumped against her back, a reminder of the job she had lost. Behind her, she could feel the delicate, trembling weight of the old woman, a stranger who had just cost her everything. And yet, as she pedaled into the freezing darkness, Marissa didn't feel regret. She just felt the strain in her legs and the steady, trusting weight on her back. The ride was a brutal crawl through a city that had surrendered to the night. The further they moved into the Upper East Side, the quieter the streets became. Here, the storm didn't feel desperate. It felt elegant, dusting the awnings of silent brownstones and the skeletal branches of trees in private gardens. It was Dominic Caravelli's world, though Marissa didn't know it. Dominic stood behind the bulletproof glass of his penthouse, staring down at the city. He wasn't seeing the beauty. He was seeing a grid of threats and territories. The phone was still pressed to his ear, the voice of his second-in-command, Marco, crackling on the line. They found evidence of the leak, Dom. It was S. He's been feeding information to the Albanians for months. Dominic's jaw tightened. Salvatore, his father's man, a relic from the old days. Another betrayal. His father had taught him two things: show no weakness and trust no one. The first lesson had made him a king. The second had made him a prisoner. "Find him." Dominic said, his voice flat and cold as the glass he touched. "And find out what he told them." And then Marco asked the question, hanging with unspoken violence. Before Dominic could answer, his private line buzzed. Only one person had that number. He cut Marco off and switched lines. It was Nico, the head of his mother's security detail, his voice tight with panic. "Sir, it's your mother. She's gone again." The carefully constructed ice around Dominic's heart cracked. A cold, familiar dread washed over him. The one feeling he couldn't control, couldn't threaten, couldn't kill. Impotence. How Dominic's voice was dangerously quiet. "I have 12 men watching that house. How did she get out?" "She was in the garden, sir. She must have slipped through the old service gate. We're searching the perimeter now. We think she's been gone less than an hour." An hour in this storm. Dominic's knuckles were white as he gripped the phone. His mother, the sharp, proud woman who had once commanded rooms with a single glance, was now wandering the frozen streets, her mind a beautiful broken labyrinth. "Every car, every man." Dominic ordered, his voice a low growl. "Find her now." He hung up the silence of the penthouse, pressing in on him. He looked out at the city again. But now he saw it through her eyes, a terrifying maze of confusing lights and threatening shadows. He was the most powerful man in the city, yet he couldn't protect his own mother from the thief inside her mind. The rage and fear were a toxic cocktail in his gut. Whoever found her, whoever was with her, would face his wrath first and his questions later. The world was a dangerous place, and kindness was a currency he no longer believed in. Meanwhile, Marissa was fighting her own battle. Her lungs burned and her thighs were on fire. The address Morgan had given her in a moment of lucidity, a grand old number on Fifth Avenue, seemed impossibly far. The bike's chain slipped, and for a terrifying second, they almost went down. "Are you all right back there, Morgan?" Marissa gasped, her voice strained. "It's cold, dear." Morgan whispered, her head resting against Marissa's back. "James always told me to wear a hat." The simple domestic memory felt so out of place in their desperate situation. "We're almost there," Marissa lied, more for herself than for the woman clinging to her. She pedaled on block after brutal block. She passed restaurants with warm golden lights spilling onto the pavement, laughter echoing from within. She saw couples huddled under awnings sharing umbrellas. Each scene of warmth and connection was a small twist of the knife. She was out here, frozen and alone, with a stranger pedaling toward a future that had just gone dark. Finally, she saw it. A massive limestone mansion set back from the street behind a formidable wrought iron fence. A single warm light shone from an upper window. "Is this it?" Marissa asked, her breath catching in her throat. Morgan didn't answer. Her silence was heavy, exhausted. Marissa coasted to the gate, her entire body trembling with cold and exertion. She gently helped Morgan off the bike, steadying the frail woman as her legs wobbled. She leaned Morgan against the cold bars of the gate and pressed the buzzer on the intercom. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a voice, sharp and suspicious, crackled through the speaker. "Who is it?" "My name is Marissa Kelly. I found a woman who says she lives here. Her name is Morgan." There was a pause. Then the voice said, "Stay right there. Don't move." Suddenly, the world exploded in light. Floodlights from the mansion roof blazed to life, turning the snow-swept street as bright as day. Headlights from inside the gate pinned her in their glare. Men in dark suits poured out from the house, their movement swift and professional. They moved with a purpose that terrified her. In seconds, she was surrounded. The cold, hard barrels of guns pointed at her from all directions. Marissa froze her hands, instinctively shooting up in the air, her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. She had stumbled out of one nightmare and straight into another. A black, armored SUV that had been parked in the circular driveway rolled silently forward. The back door opened and a man emerged. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored black coat, his face carved from stone. Even from a distance, in the blinding glare of the lights, Marissa could feel the sheer suffocating force of his presence. His eyes, cold and dark, scanned his mother, then locked onto her. It was Dominic Caravelli, and his expression was not one of gratitude. It was one of pure, animalistic fury. Dominic walked toward her, each step deliberate and heavy, the snow crunching under his expensive leather shoes. The rage radiating from him was a palpable thing more chilling than the wind. His men held their positions, a silent, disciplined wolf pack, waiting for the order from their alpha. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her worn-out jacket, her shivering frame, her old, battered bike. It was a look of instant dismissal, of contempt. He saw not a savior, but a piece of street trash who had dared to touch what was his. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. I'm Marissa. I found her at the bus stop. She was lost. Marissa's voice trembled, but she met his gaze, refusing to be completely intimidated. Dominic ignored her explanation. He turned to one of his men. Get my mother inside. Call Dr. Allister now. Two men moved forward gently, taking Morgan's arms. In a moment of clarity, Morgan looked from Dominic to Marissa, her brow furrowed. She was kind, Dominic. She said, her voice surprisingly firm. This girl, she has a warm heart. Dominic's expression didn't soften. He watched until his mother was safely inside the house. Then his attention snapped back to Marissa. The full, terrifying weight of it felt like a physical blow. What do you want? He said, the words clipped. Money. What no? Marissa was stunned. I don't want anything. I was just trying to help. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Nobody helps for free. How much? From inside his coat, he pulled out a thick money clip. With a flick of his thumb, he peeled off a wad of $100 bills. It was more money than Marissa had seen in her entire life. He held it out not as an offer, but as a transaction, an insult. Something inside Marissa snapped. The fear, the cold, the exhaustion, it all burned away, replaced by a white-hot surge of indignation. She had lost her job, her home, her last shred of hope tonight. All because she had chosen to do the right thing. And this man, this cold, arrogant prince in his castle, thought he could dismiss her humanity with a handful of cash. She looked at the money, then back at his stony face with a movement so fast it surprised even herself. She slapped his hand away. The wad of bills scattered, falling like dead leaves onto the white snow. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Dominic's men tensed their knuckles white on their weapons. No one touched Dominic Caravelli. No one. Dominic stared at her, his dark eyes narrowed. For the first time, the fury in them was replaced by something else. Shock, disbelief. He looked down at the money littering the pristine snow, then back up at the defiant girl shivering in front of him. She was cold, Marissa said, her voice shaking but clear and strong. She was scared, and no one was stopping. Not you, not your 12 men, not anyone. I brought her home. I don't need your money to know I did the right thing. She turned her back on him, on the guns, on the mansion. She walked over to her rusty bicycle, her movement stiff. She fully expected a bullet in her back or a hand to grab her shoulder and throw her to the ground. Instead, there was only that deafening silence. She swung her leg over the bike, her hands trembling too much to properly grip the handlebars at first. She took a deep, shuddering breath and prepared to pedal away back into the storm, back to a life that had just hit rock bottom. Wait. The word was a command, not a request. It stopped her cold. She turned slowly. Dominic hadn't moved. He was still staring at her, but his expression had changed. The hard, contemptuous mask had cracked, revealing something complex and unreadable beneath. He looked at her not as a nuisance, but as an anomaly, a puzzle he couldn't immediately solve. The front door of the mansion opened again. A man in a suit. Nico, the head of security, hurried out, holding a small silver object. Sir Nico said, his voice urgent as he approached Dominic. He held up the object. It was a GPS tracker designed to look like a brooch which Morgan was supposed to be wearing at all times. The device was damaged. It looks like it was shorted out by the water. That's why we couldn't get a signal. Dominic took the brooch, his thumb tracing its delicate, useless design. All his technology, all his power had failed him. And this girl with nothing but a bicycle and a threadbare scarf had succeeded. He looked back at Marissa, who was watching, her face pale in the harsh glare of the floodlights. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the raw redness of her knuckles from the cold. He saw the fierce, unbroken pride that had made her throw his money back in his face. He had built his empire on the belief that everyone had a price, that every action was driven by self-interest. This girl, in the span of 5 minutes, had shattered that belief. She didn't fit into his world. She made no sense, and that more than anything intrigued him. "My mother said you were kind." He said the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He took a step toward her. She is not often wrong about people. He bent down, and to the utter astonishment of his men began picking up the scattered $100 bills from the snow. He didn't look at Marissa as he did it. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if performing a ritual of retraction. When he had gathered them all, he straightened up and tucked the money clip back into his coat. The gesture was clear. The transaction was canneled. A different kind of interaction was beginning. "You're freezing," he stated. A simple observation, but his tone had changed. It was no longer an accusation, but a fact that seemed to trouble him. "Come inside. Get warm." Marissa hesitated, her hand still gripping her bicycle. Entering that house felt like crossing a line, stepping into a world she didn't belong in and couldn't escape. "It's not a request," Dominic said, but the threat was gone, replaced by a quiet insistence. "My mother will want to thank you properly when she's settled. It would be disrespectful to refuse." He was giving her a reason, a polite fiction, to bridge the gap between their two worlds. She looked from his unreadable face to the warm, glowing windows of the mansion. The alternative was pedaling back into the sleet, to a locked apartment and a life in ruins. Slowly, she let go of her bike. One of Dominic's men immediately stepped forward to take it, handling the rusty frame with a strange reverence. As she walked toward the massive front doors, Dominic fell into step beside her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat and power of him, a silent, dangerous presence that was now, for some inexplicable reason, focused entirely on her. "What's your name again?" he asked, as they stepped into the magnificent marble-floored foyer. "Marissa Kelly," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded as if committing it to memory. "Dominic Caravelli." He said his own name as if it were a key or a cage. She already knew. Everyone in New York's underbelly knew that name. Her father had owed money to half the city, but he had always been terrified of the Caravellis. She had just returned the lost queen of the most dangerous king in the city, and he now knew her name. The warmth of the house was a shock to her system. It was a deep, silent heat that radiated from the floors and walls, a stark contrast to the biting cold that had seeped into her bones. The foyer was vast, the ceiling soaring 2 stories high, a crystal chandelier dripping light onto the polished marble below. A grand staircase swept upwards into shadow. It was less a home and more a palace built to intimidate. A doctor with a kind, worried face was coming down the stairs. "She's stable." Dominic just cold and a little disoriented. "I've given her a mild sedative. She'll sleep through the night." Dominic just nodded, his focus still on Marissa. "Thank you, Dr. Alistair." He led her past the staircase into a cavernous living room. A fire roared in a fireplace large enough to stand in, casting dancing shadows on walls, lined with dark, imposing oil paintings. The room was beautiful, luxurious, and utterly devoid of personal touches. It felt like a museum exhibit on the life of a rich, lonely man. Dominic gestured to a deep leather armchair near the fire. "Sit." Marissa perched on the edge of the cushion, feeling small and out of place. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly conscious of her damp clothes and the grime under her fingernails. Dominic disappeared for a moment and returned with a heavy cashmere blanket. He didn't hand it to her. He unfolded it and draped it over her shoulders himself. His movements were surprisingly gentle, his large, powerful hands barely brushing against her. The blanket was incredibly soft and smelled faintly of cedar and something else she couldn't name. Power, maybe. He then went to a bar in the corner of the room and poured hot water from a silver kettle into a delicate porcelain cup. He brought it to her along with a small pot of honey and a slice of lemon. "Ta," he said, placing it on the small table beside her chair. He didn't offer any to himself. He stood by the mantel of the fireplace, one hand resting on the carved marble, and simply watched her. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire. It wasn't the comfortable silence of friends. It was the tense observational silence of a predator studying a strange new creature in its territory. Marissa's hands trembled as she lifted the cup. The warmth spread through her fingers, a small, anchoring comfort in this surreal situation. "Why did you stop for her?" he finally asked, his voice low. She looked up, surprised by the directness of the question. She looked like she needed help. Lots of people need help. You didn't stop for them. She looked lost. Marissa tried to explain her gaze, dropping to the swirling steam from her cup. And no one else was even looking at her. It didn't feel right to just ride by. The right thing. He repeated the phrase, a faint, cynical twist to his lips. "And what did doing the right thing cost you tonight?" "Marissa Kelly." He knew. The realization hit her with a fresh wave of cold. He knew she hadn't just been out for a casual ride. "I was late with my last delivery," she admitted, her voice quiet. "I lost my job." Dominic's expression didn't change. He had expected it. "And your apartment?" She flinched. How could he possibly know that? How? "When you threw my money in the snow, you became a person of interest," he said bluntly. "My men are very efficient. They know you work for Quick Eats delivery service, or rather, you did. They know you live or lived in a tenement building in Atoria. They know your landlord is a man named Stanislaw who has a strict policy about late rent, and they know you haven't paid him in 2 weeks. He paused. They also know about your father, Patrick Kelly, and the debt he left you with. Marissa felt the blood drain from her face. He had stripped her life bare in less than 15 minutes. She was no longer a person. She was a collection of unfortunate facts in his file. The blankets suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. "So you know," she whispered, her throat tight. "You know I'm desperate. You probably still think I wanted your money." "No," he said, and the certainty in his voice surprised her. "If you wanted money, you would have taken it. You're desperate. Yes, but you have pride. It's a dangerous combination." He pushed off from the mantel and walked to the massive window overlooking the city. "That man, your father, owes money to Dmitry Vulov. He is a cockroach, a bottom feeder who preys on the weak." Marissa stared at his back. "You know him." Dominic turned his head slightly, his profile sharp against the glittering cityscape. "I know everyone. And I know that men like him don't just go away." A new kind of fear, sharp and specific, pierced through her exhaustion. Dominic wasn't just making conversation. This was a chess game, and she had just realized she was a pawn on his board. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice regaining a bit of its earlier steel. He turned to face her fully. "My mother likes you. In her lucid moments, she has very good judgment. She is also vulnerable. The security I have built around her isn't enough if her own mind lets her wander into a storm." He took a step closer. "I need someone inside the house, someone who isn't just a guard or a nurse, someone she might listen to, a companion." Marissa stared at him, bewildered. "You want to hire me to be a friend to your mother?" "I want to contain a problem." He corrected his language, cold and pragmatic. "My mother's safety is a problem. Your situation with Dmitri is a problem. I am proposing a solution that solves both." "What solution?" "You will live here," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "In this house, you will have a room, food security. Your only job will be to spend time with my mother, be there when she wakes up, read to her, talk to her, and make sure she doesn't walk out into a blizzard again. In return, I will handle Dmitry Vulov. Your father's debt will be erased. Your brother will be untouched. You will be safe. The offer was staggering. It was a lifeline thrown into the abyss. But it was a lifeline thrown by the devil himself to live in this house, under this man's roof, under his control. Why? She asked the question, a whisper. Why would you do all that for a stranger? Dominic walked back to the fireplace, staring into the flames. Last night, I lost my mother. All the money, all the men in the world couldn't find her. You, a girl with nothing on a broken bicycle, brought her home. He looked at her then, and for a fleeting second she saw past the cold facade to the raw frustration and fear beneath. It's not because you did the right thing. It's because you did the impossible thing that makes you valuable. He saw her as an asset, a tool, a solution. It was a cold, brutal logic she could almost understand better than charity. I'm not one of your possessions, she said quietly. No, he agreed, a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. You are not. You will be an employee and you will be protected as such. That is the deal. Or you can walk back out that door into the storm and face the cockroaches alone. He left the choice hanging in the air, confident in his assessment of her desperation. He was right. She had no choice. But as she looked at him, a powerful, dangerous man offering her a gilded cage, she knew that accepting his help would be a different kind of danger altogether. Okay, she heard herself say, the word feeling like a surrender and a declaration of war all at once. I'll stay. A small, almost imperceptible nod was his only reaction. Good. Nico will show you to your room. We will discuss the details in the morning. He turned back to the fire, dismissing her. The audience was over. As Marissa followed the silent security man up the grand staircase, she clutched the cashmere blanket around her. It was warm and safe, but she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she had just traded one kind of prison for another. The room Nico led her to was not a guest room. It was a suite. It was decorated in soft creams and blues with a 4-poster bed, a small sitting area with a fireplace, and French doors leading to a private balcony that overlooked a snow-covered garden. It was larger than the entire apartment she and her brother had shared. On the bed, someone had laid out a set of new clothes, a simple cashmere sweater, soft wool pants, and socks. Everything was of the highest quality, and everything was in her size. The efficiency was chilling. While she had been shivering by the fire, Dominic's machine had been at work assessing her, learning her, and preparing for her assimilation. Mr. Caravelli had these sent over. Nico said, his voice impassive. There is a bathroom through that door. If you require anything, there is an intercom on the wall. He gestured to a small, discreet panel near the bed. Mrs. Caravelli's suite is at the end of this hall. She will likely sleep until late morning. With a curt nod, he left the door clicking shut behind him with a soft, final sound. Marissa was alone. She walked to the massive window and looked down. The city glittered below a sea of diamonds. She was now floating above, utterly disconnected from. She thought of her brother, safe for now at a friend's house. Unaware of how their world had just been upended, she would have to call him to invent some story about a new job, a live-in position that was too good to pass up. The lies were already beginning. The first few days were a study in surreal quiet. Marissa saw Dominic only at night. He would return late, a shadow moving through the silent house, and disappear into his own wing. They never spoke. Her instructions came through Nico or the head housekeeper, a stern but fair woman named Elena. Her job was simple to be a presence. She would have breakfast with Morgan, who was often bright and lucid in the mornings. They would talk about the garden or Morgan's childhood in Italy. In these moments, Marissa could see the woman Dominic was so desperate to protect sharp-witty with a painter's eye for color and light. But as the day wore on, the fog would roll in. Morgan would grow confused, asking for her long dead-ad husband, or mistaking Marissa for a school friend. It was in these moments that Marissa's purpose became clear. She didn't try to correct her. She would simply listen, gently guide the conversation, or suggest they look at old photo albums. Her calm, steady presence seemed to soothe Morgan in a way the rotating team of nurses couldn't. One afternoon, Marissa found Morgan standing on the balcony of her suite, staring out at the snow, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. "It's all so white," Morgan whispered, clutching a small, framed photograph. He loved the snow. Marissa came to stand beside her. The photo was of a handsome, smiling man, Dominic's father. He had a beautiful smile, Marissa said softly. Morgan looked at her, her eyes suddenly sharp. "He broke my heart, and he broke my son." She looked back out at the snow. Dominic's. He built these walls so high he forgot how to open the door. The moment of clarity passed as quickly as it came. But the words stayed with Marissa. She was beginning to see the ghost that haunted this house. Not just the looming threat of the outside world, but the internal prisons the Caravellis had built for themselves. That evening, the quiet was shattered. Marissa was in the library, a magnificent 2-story room filled with the scent of old paper and leather, trying to find a book on Italian art for Morgan. She was on a rolling ladder, reaching for a high shelf, when she heard the voices from the hallway. It was Dominic and Marco, his second in command. They hadn't seen her. "The Albanians are making another move," Marco said, his voice low and tense. "They hit one of our warehouses in Red Hook. It's a direct response to what you did to us. It was a message." Dominic's voice was cold. "And they will receive one in return. They're getting bold, Dom. Rumors are spreading. They say you're distracted, that you have a new liability." Marissa froze her hand, hovering over a book. A liability. That's what she was. The girl. Marco pressed on. "People are talking, bringing a civilian into the house. It's a risk. They'll see her as a weakness, a target. She is not a target." Dominic's voice was lethally quiet. "She is under my protection. Anyone who thinks otherwise will learn the difference between a rumor and an obituary." "Is that clear, Dom? But there is no but." Dominic cut him off. "Handle the warehouse. Double the security on this house. And Marco, stop talking about things that do not concern you." The footsteps faded down the hall. Marissa stayed on the ladder, her body trembling. The conversation had confirmed her worst fears. Her presence here wasn't just a strange arrangement, it was a danger both to herself and to him. She was in his armor, and his enemies were already probing it. Later that night, she couldn't sleep. She walked the silent halls, the moonlight striping the marble floors. She found herself in the main living room, where the fire had been reduced to glowing embers. A shape moved in the darkness by the window. It was Dominic. He was standing in the shadows, looking out at the city, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "You should be asleep," he said without turning around. "So should you," she countered, her voice quiet. He took a slow sip from his glass. "I have things on my mind." "I heard you," she said, deciding not to pretend. "In the library about me being a liability." He turned, then his face half in shadow, unreadable. "Marco speaks out of turn." "But he's right, isn't he?" Marissa took a step closer, her fear eclipsed by a need for honesty. "I don't belong here. My being here puts you and your mother in danger." My mother is safer with you here than she has been in years, he stated. It was not a compliment. It was a fact. But at what cost? What happens when your enemies decide I'm the easiest way to get to you? Then they will have made a fatal miscalculation, he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. The sheer violence simmering beneath the surface was terrifying. I don't want to be the cause of a war, she whispered, her hands clenching into fists. I can't live like this, waiting for something terrible to happen. He put his glass down and closed the distance between them in 2 long, silent strides. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat from his body. He was so tall he seemed to block out the rest of the world. You think you can just walk away? He asked, his voice a low murmur. Go back to your life. Dmitri is still out there. The moment you step outside that gate without my protection, you're dead. Your brother is dead. Do you understand? The brutal truth of his words hit her like a slap. She was trapped. So what am I supposed to do? She asked, her voice breaking. Just stay here, a prisoner in a gilded cage. His eyes softened for a fraction of a second. He reached out his fingers, brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was unexpectedly gentle, sending a jolt of electricity through her. I made a deal, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I promised you would be safe. I don't break my promises. You promised to handle the man my father owed money to, she challenged, finding her courage. You didn't promise to own me. A muscle feathered in his jaw. Is that what you think this is? I don't know what this is, she admitted. It's too much. I can't. Before she could finish, the soft chime of an intercom echoed through the room. It was the alert from Morgan's suite. Dominic's attention snapped away, his professional mask falling back into place. He went to the wall panel and pressed the button. Yes. A nurse's frantic voice came through the speaker. Sir, it's Mrs. Caravelli. She's having a nightmare. She's very agitated, and she's asking for someone named Marissa. Dominic looked at Marissa. His expression was a complex mixture of frustration and something else she couldn't decipher. The world he commanded was at his fingertips. But in this house, the one person he wanted to control was his mother, and the only person she wanted was the stranger he'd brought in from the storm. Without a word, Marissa turned and walked out of the room, heading up the stairs toward the sound of her name being called. Dominic watched her go. His hand clenched into a fist on the cold marble mantel. She was right. This was a cage. He just wasn't sure anymore who was the prisoner and who was the guard. When Marissa entered Morgan's suite, the scene was one of quiet chaos. 2 nurses were trying to soothe the old woman who was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with a terror that saw things no one else could. She was clutching the sheets, muttering a name over and over. James, James, don't leave me. Mrs. Caravelli, it's all right. You're safe. The nurse said, her voice strained with professional patience. But Morgan wasn't listening. Marissa walked slowly to the bedside. Morgan, she said softly. The old woman's frantic gaze landed on her, and the fear in her eyes lessened just a fraction. They're coming, Morgan whispered, gripping Marissa's arm. Her hand was surprisingly strong. You have to hide. Who's coming? Marissa asked gently, sitting on the edge of the bed. The shadows, Morgan said, her voice dropping. They took James. Marissa didn't know who James was. The husband, the father. But she knew the fear was real. Instead of arguing, she entered Morgan's world. It's okay, she said, taking the woman's trembling hands in her own. I'm here. I won't let the shadows get you. She began to hum a simple, nameless tune that her own mother used to hum when Marissa was a child scared of thunderstorms. She smoothed the hair back from Morgan's forehead, her touch light and steady. Slowly, the frantic energy in the room began to dissipate. The tension in Morgan's shoulders eased, and her breathing deepened. Dominic stood in the doorway, unseen, watching. He saw the way his mother, who fought the nurses, and even him, calmed under Marissa's touch. He saw a tenderness he hadn't witnessed in this house for years. Marissa wasn't following a protocol. She was offering genuine comfort, a quiet island of peace in the storm of his mother's mind. The nurses backed away, relieved, and after a few more minutes, Morgan's eyes fluttered closed, her hands still loosely holding Marissa's. Marissa stayed until she was sure Morgan was deeply asleep. When she finally stood and turned, she saw Dominic still in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He simply nodded and walked away, leaving her in the silent, moonlit room. This became their new normal. Dominic kept his distance, but he was always watching. He had cameras throughout the house, and he would often find himself pausing his work to watch the silent feed from the garden or the library where Marissa would be sitting with his mother. He saw Marissa patiently listening to the same rambling stories again and again. He saw her reading aloud from books of poetry. He saw her bring a small, injured bird she found in the garden inside, making a splint for its wing with a matchstick and a strip of cloth. Each act of quiet compassion was a mystery to him. She did it when no one was watching, when there was nothing to be gained. It was simply who she was. The liability was becoming the only source of light in his cold, dark home. His enemies, however, saw things differently. The whispers in the underworld grew louder. Dominic Caravelli, the shark. The man who had torn his own family apart to consolidate power after his father's betrayal was going soft. The girl was the reason. She was his weakness. The attack came on a Tuesday. Dominic was across town in a tense meeting with the heads of the other families, a meeting he couldn't miss. He had left Nico and a double shift of his best men at the house. He thought they were safe. Marissa and Morgan were in the carrium, a glass-walled room filled with orchids. Morgan was having a good day. She was painting her hands surprisingly steady as she mixed watercolors on a palette, telling Marissa a story about a trip to Lake Co. she'd taken as a young woman. The first sound was a soft, muffled thump from the grounds below, like a heavy bag of sand being dropped. Marissa frowned. What was that? Before anyone could answer, the glass wall of the carrium exploded inward. The world dissolved into a storm of shattering glass and concussive force. The sound was deafening. Marissa reacted on pure instinct, throwing herself over Morgan, trying to shield the older woman with her own body as the room was sprayed with deadly shards. Men in black tactical gear were swarming in from the garden, moving with brutal efficiency. Nico and his men were caught by surprise, and a fierce, close-quarters gunfight erupted in the halls. The air filled with the sharp cordite smell of gunfire and the screams of dying men. Marissa, her ears ringing, tried to pull Morgan under the heavy oak table. "We have to hide," she screamed over the den. But Morgan was frozen, her eyes wide, staring at the chaos. The shock seemed to have jolted her into a strange, hyper-lucid state. She saw one of the intruders leveling his weapon at Marissa's back. In that split second, the fierce, protective matriarch she had once been roared back to life. With a strength no one thought she still possessed, Morgan shoved Marissa hard, pushing her out of the line of fire. "No!" Morgan cried out. A gunshot cracked through the air, sharp and final. Marissa felt a spray of warmth across her face. She looked up in horror. Morgan was standing over her for a second, a look of surprise on her face before she crumpled to the floor. A dark crimson stain was spreading rapidly across the front of her white dress. Time seemed to stop. The sounds of the gunfight faded into a dull roar in Marissa's ears. All she could see was Morgan lying on the floor, the fallen watercolor palette, mixing with her blood on the white tiles, creating a grotesque abstract painting. A primal scream tore from Marissa's throat. She scrambled to Morgan's side, pressing her hands against the wound, a useless gesture against the torrent of blood. No, no, Morgan. Stay with me, she begged, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the blood on her cheek. Morgan's eyes fluttered, trying to focus on her. She reached up a trembling hand and touched Marissa's face. My brave girl, she whispered, a faint, sad smile on her lips. Then her hand fell and her eyes went vacant. The remaining intruders, hearing approaching sirens, began to retreat. The gunfight subsided. The silence that fell was more terrible than the noise. It was a silence filled with death and loss. Marissa didn't move. She just knelt there, covered in the blood of the woman she had tried to protect. Her world shattered for the second time in as many months, when Dominic burst into the room minutes later. That was the scene that greeted him. His men, dead or wounded, littered the halls, and in the center of the ruined solarium, the girl he had brought into his home was cradling his mother's lifeless body, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. He stopped dead. The air left his lungs. For a moment, he was not Dominic Caravelli, the feared mob boss. He was just a son staring at his worst nightmare made real. He looked at his mother, at the blood, at Marissa's grief-stricken face. And then something inside him broke. The ice that had encased his heart for 2 decades didn't just crack, it vaporized. All that was left was a core of pure incandescent rage. The kind of rage that burns worlds to the ground. He turned to Marco, who had followed him in his face, pale with shock. Find out who did this, Dominic said, his voice terrifyingly calm. I don't want a name. I want a family tree. I want to know where they eat, where they sleep, where their children go to school. He looked back at the scene, at the woman he had failed to protect, and the girl who had tried. And then he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, We are going to burn it all to ash. The days that followed were a silent, brutal reaping. Dominic Caravelli did not mourn with tears. He mourned with fire and steel. The city's underworld, which had grown comfortable with the unspoken rules of engagement, was about to be reminded of what happened when a true king was wounded. Dominic moved not with the hot, chaotic rage of a common thug, but with the cold, methodical fury of a fallen angel. He locked himself in his command center, a room in the penthouse that was more like a digital war room. Its walls a mosaic of glowing screens displaying security feeds, financial records, and communication intercepts. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He consumed black coffee and intelligence reports, his presence a vortex of chilling calm that terrified his own men more than any shouting ever could. Marissa remained in the house, a ghost in a palace of grief. The solarium had been cleared and repaired with chilling efficiency, but she could still see the ghost of the bloodstain on the white tiles, the phantom scent of cordite in the air. She moved through the quiet rooms, the silence now heavy with the absence of Morgan's laughter, her humming, her sudden moments of sharp clarity. Elena and the household staff moved around her with a quiet, respectful difference, treating her not as an employee, but as the lady of a house in mourning. She never asked Dominic what he was doing. She didn't have to. She could feel it in the tension that gripped the mansion, in the way his men looked at him with a mixture of fear and absolute loyalty. She heard the hushed, urgent phone calls, the names of men in places she didn't know. She was living at the epicenter of a storm, and its name was Dominic. His retribution was not a single act, but a symphony of destruction. The first to fall was the family who had ordered the attack, the Petrovic. Their top enforcer was found in his car at the bottom of the East River. Their main smuggling operation at the docks went up in flames, a spectacular inferno that lit up the night sky and made the evening news. Their network of informants was systematically dismantled, each man either disappearing or appearing on a rival's doorstep with a message carved into his skin. Dominic didn't just want to kill them, he wanted to erase them. He attacked their finances, freezing offshore accounts through a network of international contacts. He leaked information to federal agents anonymously, untraceably, that led to raids on their legitimate front businesses. He turned their allies against them with promises and threats. In less than a week, the Petrovic family, a power in the city for 50 years, was rendered extinct. They weren't just defeated, they were a cautionary tale, a myth whispered in the dark. But he didn't stop there. He went after everyone who had been associated with them, everyone who had profited from the whispers of his weakness. The shockwaves of his wrath rippled through the 5 boroughs. Men who had laughed at the rumors of the girl now found their operations crippled, their shipments seized, their safe houses compromised. Dominic was redrawing the map of his kingdom, and he was using blood for ink. Throughout it all, Marissa stayed inside the walls of the penthouse. One evening, Marco came to the house, his face grim and weary. He found Marissa in the library staring blankly at a page in a book. "He's breaking things that don't need to be broken," Marco said, his voice low as if he were confessing a sin. "He's gone too far. This isn't business anymore. It's personal. His mother was murdered in front of me," Marissa said, her voice hollow. "Of course it's personal." Marco looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of fear in the veteran soldier's eyes. "You're the only one he might listen to. This rage, if he lets it consume him, it will destroy everything he's built, everything she loved." Marissa knew he was right. The violence was a wildfire, and it would eventually burn the man she was beginning to see beneath the monster. That night, she waited for him. He came in long after midnight. He moved through the darkened living room like a phantom, his expensive coat doing nothing to hide the profound weariness in his posture. He was heading for the bar when she spoke from the armchair by the cold fireplace. "Is it over?" He stopped, his back to her. He didn't turn around. "Yes." "Are they all gone?" "They are." His voice was flat, devoid of triumph. She stood up and walked toward him. He was still facing the window, looking down at the city he had just terrorized into submission. She could see his reflection in the dark glass, a powerful man utterly alone. She came to a stop just behind him. She could smell the cold night air on his coat and something else, something metallic and faint, the smell of blood. She didn't recoil. "Dominic," she said, softly. He finally turned, and his eyes were black holes of exhaustion and grief. The fury was gone, leaving a vast, empty wasteland behind. He looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw the broken little boy whose father had betrayed him, the powerful man whose mother had been stolen from him. She did the only thing she could think to do. She reached out her small, trembling hands, taking his. His were cold stiff. She gently unfurled his clenched fists. There were scrapes on his knuckles, a small, dried cut on his palm. He had not come through this war unscathed. Without a word, she led him to the small bathroom off the foyer. She turned on the warm water, took a soft washcloth, and began to gently clean his hands. She washed away the grime, the phantom scent of violence, the dried blood that was not his own. He stood perfectly still, watching her, his powerful frame rigid. He was a man who commanded armies, who could make fortunes and end lives with a single phone call. And he was allowing her to tend to him as if he were a child. As she worked, a single tear escaped her eye and fell onto his hand. He flinched as if it had burned him. She looked up at him, her own eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored his. "This won't bring her back," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "The violence. It won't heal the part of you that's broken, Dom. It will only make the hole bigger." He stared down at her, at their joined hands under the warm water. Her words were not an accusation. They were a lament. She wasn't judging his actions. She was mourning the cost to his soul. For the first time since his mother's death, the iron control he held over himself fractured. A deep, shuddering breath escaped him, a sound of profound pain. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, his eyes squeezed shut. The great Dominic Caravelli, the king of New York's underworld, was leaning on her for support. "I don't know any other way." He confessed, his voice a raw, broken whisper against her skin. "I'll show you." She answered, her hands closing firmly around his. "Well, find it together." In the silent marble bathroom surrounded by the ghosts of his violent world, the war outside finally ended, and a new, quieter, and far more difficult battle, the one for his own soul, had just begun. The weeks that followed the storm of Dominic's revenge were unnervingly quiet. The city's underworld was licking its wounds, whispering his name with a renewed and profound terror. The balance of power had been brutally restored. But inside the penthouse, the silence was one of healing, not of fear. Dominic's war had purged his immediate need for vengeance. But Marissa's words had planted a different seed in its place. "It won't heal you." The thought echoed in the quiet moments. He began a different kind of campaign, one executed with the same ruthless efficiency, but with a new purpose. First, he dealt with Marissa's past. He didn't tell her the details. One morning, she simply received a plain envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper marked "paid in full" from a non-escript holding company, and all the original loan documents her father had signed with Dmitry Vulov canceled and void. The cockroaches had been swept away. 2 days later, a trust was established in her brother's name, an anonymous scholarship that would cover his education through any university he chose. When she tried to thank him, he cut her off. "It was a loose end," he said, his tone clipped, though his eyes held a softness she was beginning to recognize. "I don't like loose ends." It was his way of saying, "Your burdens are now my burdens." He also began to change the landscape of his own life. He started spending more time at the house, less in the shadowy boardrooms and warehouses that constituted his empire. He delegated the dirtier aspects of his operations to Marco with new, stricter rules of engagement. He started exploring legitimate investments, real estate, tech startups, pathways to a future that wasn't paved with blood money. He was doing it not just for himself, but for the possibility of a life with her, a life Morgan would have wanted for him. Marissa, in turn, began to breathe again. The constant grinding fear of the debt was gone. Knowing her brother was safe and his future secured was a gift so immense she could barely comprehend it. The penthouse, once a beautiful prison, started to feel like a sanctuary. She began to fill the house with life. She reopened the solarium, filling it with new, vibrant flowers. She convinced Elena, the stoic housekeeper, to teach her some of Morgan's old Italian recipes. Soon the sterile air of the mansion began to carry the scent of baking bread and fresh basil. She and Dominic fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. They would have dinner together most nights, not in the formal dining hall, but in the smaller, cozier breakfast nook that overlooked the garden. They talked about everything and nothing. Her childhood memories, the books he was reading, the funny things his mother used to say. They were two profoundly lonely people, cautiously learning the language of companionship. One night, as they sat by the fire, Marissa was looking through one of Morgan's old photo albums. She stopped at a picture of a young, smiling Dominic standing beside his mother, his arm slung awkwardly around her shoulder. "You look happy here," she said softly. He looked at the photo, a flicker of a long-lost memory in his eyes. "I was before my father." He stopped the wall, going back up. "Morgan told me he broke your heart," Marissa said, gently testing the waters. Dominic was silent for a long moment. My father taught me that loyalty was a commodity. He said, his voice low and hard. He sold his to the highest bidder and almost destroyed this family. I swore I would never make the same mistake. I would never trust anyone that completely again. So you trust no one? She asked. He looked at her, then his gaze, intense, searching. I am beginning to believe there may be exceptions to the rule. It was the closest he had ever come to a confession, a small crack in the fortress he had built around his heart. A few weeks later, Dominic came home early. He found Marissa in the library, a stack of pamphlets and brochures spread out on the massive desk. "What's this?" he asked, picking one up. It was for a local community center, a program for autistic youth. I was just thinking. She started, hesitant but determined. About what you did for my brother. There are so many kids out there like him, like me, who just need one chance, one person to clear a path for them. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with an idea. Morgan was so passionate about art and culture. What if we started a foundation in her name, a real one? Something clean. Something that builds things instead of breaking them. He looked at the brochures, then at her, at the passion in her face. He saw not a request for money, but a vision for a different kind of legacy, one built on hope instead of fear. He saw a way to honor his mother, a way to channel his power into something that created rather than destroyed. He saw the path she was offering him, the one she had promised to help him find. The Morgan Caravelli Foundation, he said, tasting the words. He nodded slowly. All right, Marissa, let's build something. In that moment, they were no longer a boss and his employee a protector, and his ward. They were partners, they were equals. They were two broken people who had found in each other a reason to rebuild. The house was no longer a sisut, it was becoming a home. The creation of the Morgan Caravelli Foundation became their shared purpose. It was a new, unfamiliar world for Dominic. Instead of navigating the treacherous currents of the underworld, he was now dealing with lawyers, accountants, and non-profit charters. He attacked the challenge with his usual intensity, but this time, his goal was creation, not domination. Marissa was the heart of the operation. She had a natural, intuitive understanding of what was needed. She drafted the mission statement, focusing on providing scholarships for arts and education to underprivileged youth. The two things Morgan had cherished most. She spent her days researching community needs, visiting struggling neighborhoods, and talking to the people she wanted to help. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was building. The girl who had once peddled through the cold for a few dollars was now shaping a multi-million-dollar philanthropic endeavor. Dominic found himself watching her in awe. He saw her argue passionately with a board of stuffy lawyers about the importance of an emergency fund for students who couldn't afford a winter coat. He saw her sit on the floor of a rundown community center, patiently helping a teenage boy with his college application. She was fierce and compassionate, practical and idealistic, all at once. She was everything his world was not. And he found he wanted to be a part of hers. The foundation was launched 6 months after Morgan's death. The opening was a quiet affair held at the first community arts center they had funded, a beautifully renovated old warehouse in the Bronx. There were no mobsters, no politicians, just the students, their families, and the community leaders they were there to serve. Dominic stood at the back of the room, uncharacteristically out of the spotlight, watching as Marissa took the stage. She looked radiant, confident, her voice clear and strong as she spoke about Morgan's legacy and the foundation's promise. This foundation isn't about charity, she said, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. It's about investment. It's about believing that talent and heart exist everywhere, and sometimes all they need is a door to be opened. As she spoke, Dominic felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling he hadn't known since he was a boy. This was real power. Not the power to take a life, but the power to change one. This was a legacy his mother would have been proud of. This was a legacy he could be proud of. After the ceremony, as the crowd thinned, he found her standing alone, looking at a mural the students had painted on one of the walls. It was a vibrant, chaotic explosion of color depicting the New York skyline. "You were incredible," he said, his voice soft. She turned a genuine happy smile on her face. "We did it, Dom. It's real. You did it," he corrected. "You gave it a soul." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the celebration echoing around them. "I don't think I ever properly thanked you," she said, her expression turning serious. "For everything paying the debt my brother this." She gestured around the room. "You saved my life?" "No," he said, turning to face her, his gaze intense. "You saved mine." And in the middle of the crowded room, surrounded by the hopeful, vibrant life they had built together, he leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion or possession, but one of profound gratitude and deep, unspoken emotion. It was a promise. It was a beginning. In that kiss, the last walls around his heart crumbled to dust. The ghost of his father, the pain of his mother's illness, the cold loneliness of his throne. It all faded away, replaced by the simple, undeniable warmth of her lips, the feeling of finally, after a lifetime of searching, being truly home. A year later, the city was the same, but their world had been remade. The Morgan Caravelli Foundation was a resounding success, a beacon of hope in the city's forgotten corners. Marissa was its driving force, a respected figure whose name was associated with integrity and genuine change. Dominic, while still the undisputed head of the Caravelli family, had fundamentally altered its trajectory. He had divested from the most violent of his enterprises, channeling his formidable intellect and resources into legitimate businesses that now funded the foundation. His enemies still feared him, but now they also respected him in a new way. He was no longer just a shark. He was an empire builder. Their life together had settled into a rhythm of shared purpose and quiet intimacy. The penthouse was filled with the sound of laughter. They hosted small dinners not with capos and soldiers, but with artists, teachers, and the students the foundation supported. The house had a soul now. It had her. One crisp November evening, almost exactly 2 years after the night they met, Dominic told Marissa he wanted to take her somewhere. He drove himself in a simple, elegant sedan, not the armored SUV. They drove out of the glitter of Manhattan and back into the gritty, familiar streets of Queens. He parked across from the desolate bus stop. It was still there, the plastic shelter still cracked. The wind was cold, carrying the first hint of winter, the same wind that had blown on that fateful night. They got out of the car and stood on the sidewalk that passed a tangible presence between them. "This is where it started." Marissa said, her voice a whisper. "This is where I got my mother back." Dominic said, for a little while at least. "And where I found you." He opened the trunk of the car. Inside was a brand new bicycle. It was a beautiful, state-of-the-art touring bike, its frame a deep, elegant midnight blue. It was a world away from the rusty, groaning machine she had ridden that night. Marissa stared at it, her throat tight. "That old bike brought my mother home," Dominic said, his voice thick with emotion as he lifted the new one out. "It's the most valuable thing I own. It's hanging in the study now." He turned to her, his dark eyes full of a love so profound it took her breath away. But I realized I was still missing something. He held the handlebars of the new bike out to her. "This one is for all the journeys we have left to take." She looked from the bike to his face, her eyes shimmering with tears. I spent my whole life building an empire to keep the world out, Marissa, he said, his voice low in earnest. But you walked right through the gates. You didn't just bring my mother home from the cold. You brought me home. He let go of the bike and took her hands in his. I don't want to be your protector anymore, or your boss. I want to be your partner, your husband. He didn't get down on one knee. He didn't offer a ring. It wasn't his style. His proposal was a statement, a promise as solid and unshakable as the man himself. I want to be the one who brings you home, he said, his voice raw with a lifetime of unspoken longing. Every day for the rest of our lives. Marissa couldn't speak. She just threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his yote. The tears she had held back for so long finally falling, not in sorrow, but in a wave of overwhelming joy and relief. He held her tight, his hand stroking her hair. The king of the city, holding his entire world in his arms. A cold gust of wind swirled around them, but for the first time, Marissa didn't feel it. She was surrounded by a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the warmth of being found, of being seen, of being loved. It was the warmth that had begun 2 years ago, a tiny defiant flame on the back of a bicycle. A warmth that had survived the storm and had finally, truly brought them both